What is going on, guys? It's Modded Warfare here. Welcome back to another episode of PS3 tutorials. So in this tutorial I'm going to be showing you guys how to install Linux on your jailbroken PS3. Now if you want to just jump to the start of the tutorial, I'll put a link down at the bottom of the screen, but I do need to explain a few things here right from the start. So first of all, Linux unfortunately is not as great on the PS3 as I thought it was, so I do apologize for kind of hyping it up before, because it's not as good as I thought it would be. I assumed it would be pretty good on the PS3, considering the fact that the PS3 used to have the other OS feature on retail PS3s that you could use to boot into Linux, but then of course Sony removed that feature in a future update. And I thought, well, with custom firmware, it just basically re-enables the other OS features so that we can still have that same Linux experience on custom firmware. But unfortunately, that's not quite the case, because when Sony locked down the other OS feature, they also locked down access to the RSX NVIDIA GPU chip that the PS3 uses. And therefore, there's still no hardware acceleration. There's no 3D hardware acceleration that utilizes that GPU chip in the PS3. So unfortunately, Linux is significantly nerfed, even on custom firmware, because you don't have any hardware acceleration. So Linux is still good for, you know, just running like a low power web server or file server or SSH server, something like that. And you can of course use the desktop GUI and use it as like a desktop computer for web browsing or documents and stuff like that, or downloading files. Also, another big limiting factor as well is that you can only install older Linux operating systems right now, because we have to use something called Petiteboot or Petiteboot, which is a kind of older Linux loader, and it's not compatible with newer Linux kernels. So newer Linux operating systems are not going to run. So you have to use older versions of Linux operating systems to run on here. We're going to be installing Red Ribbon Linux in this video, which is a version of Linux that's kind of designed to run on the PS3. But of course you can install other operating systems like Ubuntu and Debian, but you have to use older versions like Debian version 8 instead of the latest version in order to run it on the PS3. So there's quite a lot of limiting factors that really makes Linux far from optimal on the PS3. And lastly, installing Linux to the internal hard drive of the PS3 does require you to reformat the PS3 hard drive, which we can do on the PS3 itself, but that will mean you'll lose all of the files that are currently on your PS3 hard drive, your package files, your games, your apps. So make sure you back up any of that stuff before doing this. I may do a tutorial on how to install Linux to an external device like a USB drive or external hard drive. That way you won't have to lose the files on your internal PS3 hard drive, but obviously you'll have to have the external device plugged in every time you want to boot into Linux, whereas this method, installing to the internal hard drive, means you'll have Linux on there all the time, able to boot into Linux at any point, regardless of any external devices that are plugged into the PS3. And I'm going to be totally honest, I'm not very knowledgeable about Linux on the PS3, so I'm essentially referring to a guide myself on how to do this, which is a guide by DazaXX, so credit to him for making the original guide. If you want the text tutorial instead of watching this video tutorial, then it will be linked in the description, because I'm essentially just doing a video version of this guy's guide on installing Linux. So full transparency there. From this guide here, I've gone ahead and downloaded this Rebug 4.81.2 Linux package, and as you can see, I've got it downloaded to my desktop. Now in here there's going to be a bunch of different things. Now the first thing we need to do is downgrade our PS3 to this update right here, this Rebug 4.81.2 Drex. We want this special patched update installed. So you're going to have to make sure that you can downgrade your system software version to do that. As I showed before in episode 10, I believe. The playlist link is in the description to all the previous episodes, so you can check back on that episode if you're not sure how to downgrade your custom firmware. But you want to download either QA Toggle Habib if you're not on a Rebug firmware, and then you just install this and run it, and that will toggle the QA flag, which will allow you to downgrade. Or if you have Rebug Toolbox installed and you're on a Rebug firmware like Rebug Rex, then you can run the Rebug Toolbox. So then go over to Utilities and make sure Toggle QA Flag is enabled, which will allow you to downgrade your custom firmware. And also in information, you want to check to make sure that your LV2 kernel is DEX and your target type is DEX, which means you're on a DEX kernel type. If it's KEX, then you haven't followed my previous episode, episode 11, which shows you how to convert from KEX, CEX, to DEX, DEX kernel types. So we covered that in the last video, so you can check back on the last video in order to install DEX. Once you've done that, you've confirmed those two things, you can quit out to your XMB. Okay, so what you're going to want to do first of all is, once you've downloaded the RAR file, I'm going to create a folder here called PS3 Linux, and we're just going to extract the contents of this RAR file into that folder. Okay, so open up this folder, and then what you want to do is grab a USB drive, and of course make sure that the USB drive is in FAT32 format. So file system should be FAT32. If it's not, back up any data that's already on the drive and then reformat it by right clicking, going to format and selecting file system as FAT32. If you have no FAT32 option, then you'll have to use a third-party formatting tool. I'll put one in the description that you can use to format the USB drive in FAT32 format. But once you have it in FAT32 format, we're going to create a folder on here called PS3 in uppercase. And then we're going to create another folder called update, also in uppercase. And then in that folder, we're going to copy this Rebug 4.81.2 into that folder. So this is the structure you should have: your USB drive or removable disk or whatever it's called, and then PS3, and then update, and then the pup file goes inside the update folder. Okay, and once it's copied over, you can rename it, so it's just called PS3 updat.pup, and you're good to go. So now what you need to do is unplug your USB drive from your computer and plug it into your PS3. Okay, so what you want to do on the PS3 is, of course, go to System Update, Update via Storage Media, and select the update, and let it do its thing. Again, if you run into any errors, where it says the data is corrupted, then that means that you don't have the QA flag toggled. Otherwise, you will get that data corrupted message when you try to do the system update to a lower firmware. Also, don't worry, we're not going to stay on this older firmware version. We're just staying on this version to install Linux. Once Linux is fully installed, we can then update back up to 4.84 or 4.85 custom firmware, as long as it's a DEX version, basically. We can update to 4.84 or 4.85 custom firmware, and then we'll still have access to Linux. We just need to be on this older firmware version while we're doing the installation. Okay, and we're back. So what we're going to do is we're going to log back in, and as you can see, we're still on DEX. And if I go to system settings, system information, just to check, you can see we're now on version 4.81, so we have successfully downgraded. So now we're ready to go through the steps to install. Now this is the part where it's going to wipe your hard drive. So back up any data that's on your hard drive, clone it, create an image of your disk, of your PS3 hard drive onto your computer, or just back up the files that are on your PS3, any package files, any games or anything. Back that up. You can use multi-man to copy them to your computer, or use FTP to transfer your games to your computer, just to keep them as a backup if you need to, or you can just reinstall everything once you're done. But yeah, unfortunately this process does have to reformat your hard drive, because it has to essentially repartition the hard drive so that it keeps a separate partition for Linux and a different partition for the PS3's operating system. Kind of basically a dual boot system is what we're doing. So we're going to have one partition to boot Linux, the other partition for the PS3's operating system. So yeah, this is the kind of point of no return where we're going to have to reformat our hard drive, and you will lose your data if you don't back it up beforehand. So you have been warned. So what we're going to do now is turn off our PS3. Okay, so now what we're going to do is hold down the power button on your PS3 until you hear it beep twice. Okay, so that will boot you into safe mode. Okay, so once you're in safe mode, you're going to want to make sure you plug in your USB cable from your PS3 controller to your PS3. and then press the PS button, and that'll take you to this menu here. And then you want to go down to option number 5, restore PS3 system. And it'll say, you know, this will format all the data will be deleted and it cannot be restored. Are you sure? You'll have to say yes, and again, make sure you've backed up any data that you want to keep on your PS3 hard drive before doing this. Alright, so we'll just go through the normal initial setup, and there we go. So the system reset was now successful, but as you can see, everything's gone. So what that basically did is this update, this 4.81 update, is actually a patched / modified version of the 4.81 custom firmware, so that when you reset the system, it's been modified that it doesn't just do the normal reformat, it actually properly partitions the drive into the 2 sections. So you may notice a loss of space when you go to view your hard drive and see how much space is left. You might notice a bunch of space is gone, and that's because that's a separate partition that's going to be used for our Linux installation. So what we have to do now is we have to install Petiteboot. So to install that, what we're going to do is we're going to head back over to our computer, and you want to unplug your USB drive and plug it back into your computer. And then on the computer here, we're going to go into the USB drive, remove this folder, and open up PS3 Linux. And this time we're going to take Petiteboot, and you need to make sure you select the correct version depending on whether you have a NAND or a NOR system. So if you have a NOR system like mine, you just copy the image into the root of your USB drive, just like that. If you have a NAND system, then copy this one in. You need to make sure you get it right. So if you go to ps3devwiki.com, which I'll link in the description, you can compare your model. So your model will be on a little sticker on your console. So if you find the model that's on the sticker on your console and then compare it with the models that are here. So mine's a CECHM03, so it's CECHMXX. And then it tells you if yours is a NOR system or a NAND system right here in this table. So you can check to see if your system is a NAND or a NOR system. If you have a PS3 Slim, it's always going to be a NOR system. So all the PS3 Slims are NOR systems, so you don't have to bother checking. But if you have a fat PS3, then you might have one of these older NAND versions. So you got to check. Once you know if you have a NAND or a NOR system, then pick the correct Petiteboot image for your system, whether it's NAND or NOR. So mine's NOR, so I put the NOR system one on there, and we are good to go. So now we can unplug the USB drive again and plug it into our PS3. And on the PS3, we're going to need to go back into the Rebug toolbox, so I'll have to reinstall it here. Luckily it comes with the firmware, so you can just go to Install Package Files, PS3 System Storage, and select Rebug Toolbox. And that should reinstall it for us, and then we can run it here. Okay, so once you're back on Rebug Toolbox, you're going to head over to Utilities and scroll down to Resize vFlash/NAND regions. Select that option, say yes, and it should say success. And then, as it said there, you want to go ahead and reboot the system. Okay, so once you reboot, go back into Rebug Toolbox again. So once you're back in Rebug Toolbox, head back to Utilities, and this time we're going to select the option to install Petiteboot. So select that option and say yes. And then once this is done, you'll have to reboot again. Okay, there you go. So Petiteboot has been installed. Enjoy other OS. And then once again, as I said, just go ahead and restart the system. Do a full on-off cycle. Okay, so now that we've rebooted for the second time, we are pretty much ready to install Linux now. So again, unplug your USB drive from the PS3 and plug it back into your computer. Okay, so on the computer, if you go to your USB drive, we can now delete this image, this Petiteboot image, open PS3 Linux, open up the red ribbon ISO file. Now, if you have WinRAR, you can just open the ISO in WinRAR. So if you have WinRAR installed, but double clicking the ISO does not allow you to open it, you can right click and go to Open With and select WinRAR Archiver, or choose another app and select WinRAR as the app you want to open the ISO in. WinRAR you can just install. I'll link it in the description if you don't already have it. Otherwise you have to use some other kind of ISO extracting software like Power ISO or something like that. whereas it's easier to just open it in WinRAR and extract the contents of the ISO file to the root of the USB drive. Okay, there we go. So once you've extracted those files to the root of the USB drive, you also want to extract the create HDD region.sh script and also copy that to the root of the USB drive. Alright, so once you're done that, you can unplug the USB and plug it back into the PS3. And once again, head back to the renowned Rebug toolbox. Okay, so at this point, you want to plug in a USB keyboard or mouse into your PS3. And of course, there are 3 USB ports on the majority of PS3s, unless you have one of the really old ones that has like 4 USB ports in the front. But most PS3s have 2 USB ports in the front and 1 at the back. So you can plug in a keyboard and a mouse to like the front of the PS3, and then you still have 1 USB port free for a USB drive, which we need obviously to currently boot from Linux to install it. But you can of course just get like a USB hub adapter that you can plug in that gives you more USB ports. I've got this cheap one from Amazon Basics that gives me 4 extra USB 2 ports. It's super cheap, so if you want to get that to have more USB ports so you can plug in more devices, then that is totally fine. So okay, so then you want to head down to boot other OS and select that option and select boot LV1 patches use current, and then say yes to load other OS. Alright, so there you go. So my keyboard is now working. Okay, so don't select any of these options to boot any of these versions. What you want to do is press escape to exit, and that will take you to the shell. I'll try and zoom in on this because it's super small and hard to read. But basically what you want to do is type cd space /tmp /petiteboot, Petiteboot technically, Petiteboot, and then /mnt and then if you're on a NAND system it's SDD1, and if you're on a NOR system it's SDA1. So again, you can check your whether you have a NAND or NOR system as you did before, and then go ahead and press enter once you've entered the correct command. So in my case it's SDA1 for NOR, so I'm going to press enter, and that's going to take me into that location. Then I'm going to type in ls, which lists all the directories inside that that partition or drive, and you can see we have our create HDD region script in there that's green because it's script, it's runnable, so we can go ahead and run that script. So to run a script you do dot / so full stop / and then the name of the script, which in this case is create _HDD _region .sh, and go ahead and press enter, and then that should do its thing. And then once that's done, you want to just type in Petiteboot, press enter, and then you want to go to the top option. Whoa, what the hell? Okay, I fucked up something. Let me press exit. Oh, I think I may have fixed it. So you have to do exit to actually boot you back to get out of that directory that we were in, because we were still in the SDD1 or SDA1, and we're trying to boot Petiteboot from there. So what you want to do to stop that weirdness from happening is type exit, press enter. That should take you back to this PS3 Linux thing. Then type Petiteboot from there, Petiteboot, and now as you can see it's working properly. Okay, so let's select the live option, which is the top option here. So we're going to go ahead and select that, and that should start booting the thing. System is going down now, ... Okay, so I think that just, yeah, so but yeah, you have to wait for it to do its thing, and there we go, we got our penguins. That's a good sign. And there we are, Red Ribbon Linux. Okay, and there we go. So we're booted up into Linux here. As you can see, it is working. Alright, so now that we're on here, but we're just booting the live version off the USB stick right now. So we need to actually install Red Ribbon Linux to the hard drive. So we're going to go ahead and select install Red Ribbon Linux, the shortcut here on the desktop. And we're going to go up with our selections, so you got to select your, you know, your language and everything. Select your language there. Do you want to continue? Just say yes. Just go with the normal default name. Do you want to install hard disk space reserved? Yes. That's good if that message comes up. You want to do automatic partitioning if it will work for you. Yeah, so it just says that they're not aligned properly for me and it screws up, so I'm not sure if there's a problem with my hard drive. Hopefully that'll work for you, because you're supposed to just do automatic partitioning and it should work, but for me it's not working at all. So I guess I'm going to use current partitions. All partitions will be formatted, data will be destroyed. So I'm just going to go ahead and say yes, and that should hopefully start doing its thing and installing. So hopefully the automatic partitioning will work for you. If not, just do current partition and let it do its thing. You know, it'll erase anything that was on the partitions before. There shouldn't really be anything on them though, because you've just created those extra blank partitions for the Linux installation, so we should be okay. Okay, so there we go. So you must enter a username. So I guess we'll go with modded and enter a password. Just do test123. And let's see, applying settings, install succeeded, restart your computer to use the raw system. You got it, boss. Okay, so now we can go to the top right, click the little power button in the top right, and then as you can see it's got all these different options. Do you want to shut down, reboot, boot game OS, lock session, or log out? So if you boot game OS, that should bring you back to the PS3's normal home screen. So this is us just checking to make sure the installation is all fine, that we can still go back to our PS3, and that we can get back to Red Ribbon Linux again. So there you go, restarting system, please remove USB flash drive. So that's true. Unplug your USB drive, because you shouldn't need it anymore, because we're not booting from it anymore. We've installed it to that partition on the hard drive, so now we shouldn't need the USB drive when we want to boot back into Red Ribbon Linux. So we can press enter to continue. And there we go, that shuts us down. And there we go, we're back onto the PS3. Okay, so now that we have Linux fully set up on the PS3, we can access it whenever we want from the Rebug toolbox, and then we can just boot back to Game OS whenever we want to go back to the PS3's operating system. So now all we need to do is update our system back to the firmware that it was on before, because right now we're still on 4.81, that modified 4.81 firmware version. So we're going to update back to the firmware we were on when we started the video. So if we get our USB stick again for the last time and plug it into our PS3, and then we go on to the USB stick, just make sure you delete the Red Ribbon Linux that's in the USB stick. We don't need it anymore now that it's installed to the hard drive. And then we're going to create our normal update folders. So we're going to create PS3 in uppercase, update also in uppercase, and then we're going to get our custom firmware. So for me, that's 4.84 DREX. Make sure you download the DEX version. So the DREX version of Rebug Rex. Just download the latest version, whether that's 4.84 or 4.85 by the time you're watching this video. So I've got it downloaded right here. And then when you open this, there's a text file, and inside that text file is the download link to the custom firmware. That you can just go ahead and paste that download link into your browser, download the custom firmware, and then put that into the update folder. And this shouldn't affect Linux. When we update using this, and we're back on the firmware that we were on at the start, we should still have Linux installed. Okay, there we go. So now I can rename this to PS3 update, or updat, PS3 updat.pup. And now you can unplug the USB and plug it into your PS3. And on the PS3, of course, we go to System Update, Update via Storage Media, and there's 4.84.2, Rebug Rex, DREX version, and there we go, we can start doing the update. Okay, so here we are booted back up after the update. So if I go to my system settings, check our firmware version down in the bottom, system information. So as you can see, we're now on 4.84, so we've updated, but we should still have access to Linux. So if we just head back down to boot other OS and boot LV1 patches using current. Yes. And there we go, Red Ribbon Linux. I'll press enter. Okay, and there we go. We're now back into Linux, even though we've updated to 4.84 or 4.85. You can see that Linux is still up and running, it's still working. So if we go ahead and shut down, we can boot game OS, and then that should bring us back to the XMB. So now you can switch back and forth between Red Ribbon Linux and the normal PS3 operating system. Just go into Rebug Toolbox, launch other OS, and then select enter on Red Ribbon Linux. And that'll boot you into Linux. When you want to go back to the PS3's operating system, just shut down, boot game OS, and you're back to the PS3's operating system again. And there we go. So yeah, that's it. That's how you install Linux on a jailbroken PS3. Unfortunately, it's not as good of an experience as I was hoping it would be, given the fact that there's no 3D hardware acceleration built in. Plus, you have to use older versions of operating systems. Like, you can install Debian and Ubuntu, but you have to install older versions of Debian and Ubuntu, like Debian version 8 rather than the latest version, because Petiteboot unfortunately isn't compatible with newer Linux operating systems. They changed something in newer Linux operating systems in the Linux kernel that prevents Petiteboot from working with them, so you have to use older versions. So yeah, it's severely nerfed unfortunately, but if you just want to use it as a web server, a file server, SSH, you're probably better installing Debian for stuff like that, or just as a text-based Linux operating system. Then you can do that, and it's definitely, you know, useful in that sense. And of course, you can use the desktop GUI just to browse the web, download files, use, you know, Word documents and stuff. That's up to you. So anyway, hope you guys enjoyed the video or found the information useful. If you did, please leave a like and subscribe, and I'll hopefully see you guys in the next video.